When a tear in the family's most cherished heirloom revealed a hidden message, the Reynolds discovered a mystery waiting to be unraveled. Welcome to our channel, where we write fascinating tales of people, places, and values. Be sure to like and subscribe so that we can continue creating the stories you love. The attic was a space of quiet reverence in Louise Reynolds' home. Dust motes floated lazily through beams of sunlight that streamed from a small, cracked window, casting a golden glow over the cluttered room. Among the forgotten treasures and time-worn boxes, one item commanded special attention: the Reynolds family quilt. It lay folded atop an antique cedar chest, its colors faded but vibrant in memory, each patch telling a story of its own. The quilt was more than an heirloom. It was the living history of the Reynolds family. Each square of fabric had been carefully chosen and sewn by hands now long gone, beginning with Louise's grandmother, Clara. Clara had started the quilt as a young bride, using scraps of fabric from meaningful moments in her life. The square of pale blue was cut from her wedding dress. The deep crimson came from the ribbon she wore in her hair during her first dance with Louise's grandfather. Over the years, the quilt had grown, each generation adding patches to commemorate births, weddings, triumphs, and even sorrows. For Louise, the quilt was a tangible link to the past. Every stitch seemed to hum with the voices of those who had come before her. The quilt had seen better days. Some of its patches were frayed, and its edges bore the wear of countless winters when it had served as both warmth and comfort. Yet, despite its tattered state, it remained the heart of the family's legacy. Today, Louise was preparing for the annual family reunion, a tradition she had upheld for decades. This year felt different. Her children and grandchildren were scattered across the country, their busy lives pulling them further from home. Louise worried that the threads holding the family together were fraying, just like the quilt. Perhaps, she thought, bringing out the quilt could remind everyone of their shared roots. She gingerly unfolded the quilt and spread it across the attic's wooden floor. Kneeling beside it, she traced her fingers over the patches, memories flooding back with each touch. There was the cheerful yellow square from her daughter Mary's first Easter dress, the sturdy brown from her son Peter's scout uniform, and the delicate floral pattern that had belonged to her mother's apron. Louise smiled softly, the weight of years both heavy and sweet. "Grandma," a voice called from the attic stairs. It was Emma, her 17-year-old granddaughter, who had arrived early to help with the preparations. Emma was the dreamer of the family, always scribbling in her notebook or lost in thought. She climbed the creaky steps and gasped when she saw the quilt spread out before her. "Wow," Emma said, kneeling beside Louise. "Is this the quilt you always talk about?" Louise nodded, her eyes sparkling. "It's been with us for a long time. Every piece here has a story." Emma's eyes roamed over the quilt, her fingers brushing the fabric as if absorbing its history. "Can you tell me about some of them?" Louise's smile widened. "Of course, my dear. Let's start with this one." She pointed to a patch of faded lavender. "This came from your great-grandmother Clara's Sunday dress. She wore it the day she and your great-grandfather decided to buy their first home. They didn't have much, but they had each other." For the next hour, Louise and Emma pored over the quilt, sharing laughter and tears as the stories unfolded. Emma listened with rapt attention, her imagination painting vivid scenes of a time she had never known. It was as if the quilt had bridged the gap between generations, weaving their lives together in its fabric. By the time the rest of the family arrived later that afternoon, the quilt had been moved to the living room, proudly displayed on the back of the sofa. It became the centerpiece of the reunion, drawing family members together as they shared their own memories of the patches. The quilt's legacy was alive, breathing in the stories they told and the connections it rekindled. As the evening wound down, Louise caught Emma gazing at the quilt with a thoughtful expression. "What's on your mind, dears?" Louise asked. Emma hesitated, then said, "I think this quilt is amazing. But what happens when it's too old to last? What if it falls apart one day?" Louise placed a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. "Then we'll mend it, just like we mend everything else in this family. That's what the quilt teaches us, Emma." It's not just about the past. It's about making sure the future has something to hold on to. Emma nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. In that moment, she understood the quilt's true power. It wasn't just fabric and thread. It was the spirit of the Reynolds family, stitched together with love, resilience, and hope. The family reunion was in full swing, laughter and chatter filling every corner of Louise Reynolds's home. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandchildren spilled out into the yard, their voices carrying on the summer breeze. Inside, the living room had become a gallery of memories, with framed photographs and scrapbooks scattered on tables. At the center of it all, draped carefully over the sofa, was the family quilt. Emma had taken charge of presenting the quilt, eagerly retelling the stories Louise had shared with her earlier. Her enthusiasm had drawn a small crowd of children and adults alike. As Emma pointed out the patches and their histories, Louise watched from her armchair with quiet pride. It warmed her heart to see the younger generation engaging with the family's legacy. But then came the gasp. A sharp, collective intake of breath snapped Louise's attention back to the quilt. Emma stood frozen, her hand clutching a corner of the quilt that now hung limp in her grasp. A jagged tear ran through one of the oldest patches, a faded blue square that had been part of Clara's wedding dress. "Oh no," Emma whispered, her face pale. "I'm so sorry, Grandma. I didn't mean to." The room fell silent as every eye turned to Louise. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the damaged quilt. Then she exhaled softly and smiled, though her voice was tinged with sadness. "It's all right, Emma. Things like this happen. What matters is that we can fix it." Louise stood and carefully gathered the quilt into her arms, her fingers gently tracing the torn edge. The family murmured reassurances, and the conversation gradually resumed, though a somber note lingered. Louise carried the quilt upstairs to her sewing room, Emma trailing behind her. The sewing room was a cozy space, filled with spools of thread, fabric scraps, and the comforting hum of past projects. Louise laid the quilt on the work table and retrieved her sewing kit. "Can I help?" Emma asked hesitantly. Louise nodded. "Of course, dear. But first, let's take a closer look." She turned the quilt over, inspecting the tear. It was then that something unusual caught her eye. Beneath the frayed edges of the torn patch was a faint line of stitching that didn't match the rest of the quilt. Louise frowned and leaned closer, her fingers probing the fabric. "What is it?" Emma asked. "I'm not sure," Louise murmured. "But this stitching, it's not mine, and it's not Clara's either. It looks like—" Her voice trailed off as her fingers found the edge of something tucked beneath the patch. Carefully, she eased the fabric aside to reveal a small, hidden pocket sewn into the quilt. Emma leaned in, her eyes wide. "There's something inside." Louise's hands trembled slightly as she reached into the pocket and pulled out a folded piece of yellowed paper. She unfolded it slowly, revealing neat, cursive handwriting. Her breath caught as she recognized the signature at the bottom, Clara Reynolds. "It's a letter," Louise said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma's excitement bubbled over. "What does it say?" Louise adjusted her glasses and began to read aloud. The letter was brief but cryptic, written in a tone both wistful and urgent. Clara spoke of a treasure that she had hidden to protect the family during a time of strife. She mentioned an unresolved conflict and expressed hope that one day, the quilt would guide her descendants to what had been lost. The letter ended with a simple plea: mend what was broken. Louise set the letter down, her mind racing. A treasure? A conflict? She had always known Clara as a steadfast, practical woman. What could have driven her to hide such a secret? "What do you think it means?" Emma asked, her eyes shining with curiosity. "I don't know," Louise admitted. "But it seems we have more to mend than just this quilt." As the evening wore on, Louise shared the discovery with the rest of the family. The letter sparked a flurry of questions and theories. Who had Clara been protecting? What kind of treasure had she hidden? And what was the conflict that had remained buried for so long? Amid the speculation, one thing became clear. The quilt had taken on a new significance. It was no longer just a testament to the family's past but also a key to uncovering a mystery that had lain dormant for generations. And as Louise looked around the room, seeing her family united in their curiosity and determination, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this journey would strengthen the bonds that had begun to fray. With the torn patch carefully mended and the letter safely tucked away, the family retired for the night, their minds buzzing with possibilities. For Louise, the quilt had always been a symbol of resilience. Now, it seemed it would also be the catalyst for something much greater. The next morning, the Reynolds family gathered in the dining room over coffee and breakfast, the atmosphere buzzing with anticipation. Clara's letter, now carefully pressed between the pages of a book, lay on the table. The words, "mend what was broken," hung in the air, sparking debates and theories. "Do you think there's really a treasure?" Peter asked, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "I'm not sure it's treasure in the way we're imagining," Louise said, glancing at the letter again. Clara wasn't a woman given to frivolity. Whatever she was hiding, it must have meant something significant to her. "What about the conflict she mentioned?" asked Mary, Louise's eldest daughter. What could have been so serious that she felt the need to hide something? Emma, who had been quietly flipping through old photo albums retrieved from the attic, suddenly looked up. What if it has to do with other family members? Clara didn't live in isolation. Maybe the conflict wasn't just within her immediate family. Louise considered this. Clara's generation had seen its share of hardship, from economic downturns to wartime struggles. And while the Reynolds family had always prided itself on being close-knit, Louise knew there were branches of the family tree that had grown distant over the years. "If there are answers, we'll find them," Louise declared. "We need to dig deeper into our history." The family sprang into action. Old letters, records, and photographs were unearthed from boxes stored in the attic and basement. Together, they pored over the items, piecing together fragments of the past. The search unearthed long-forgotten names, faded portraits, and cryptic notes scrawled in margins. It was Emma who found the first real clue. She had been flipping through an old journal that had belonged to Louise's mother, Margaret, when she stumbled across a passage referencing Aunt Beatrice's quarrel. Beatrice, Clara's younger sister, had been a figure shrouded in mystery. Louise remembered hearing whispers about her as a child, but the details had been scarce. "What does it say?" Mary asked, leaning over Emma's shoulder. Emma read aloud, "It's such a shame about Beatrice. I fear her stubbornness will keep us apart forever. Clara is heartsick over the rift, but she says some things cannot be undone." The room fell silent as the weight of the words settled over them. "What happened to her?" Peter asked. "I don't know," Louise admitted. "But it sounds like Beatrice and Clara had a falling out. Maybe that's what Clara was referring to in the letter." Further digging revealed a lead, a faded postcard from a town called Maplewood, signed simply B. The postmark was dated 1943, years after the journal entry about the quarrel. The postcard's message was brief and formal, as if written by someone unsure of her welcome. "I hope this finds you well. Thinking of you often. B." "Maplewood isn't far from here," Emma said. What if she or her family is still there? The idea was met with a mix of excitement and hesitation. Reaching out to long-lost relatives was uncharted territory, but the curiosity sparked by Clara's letter was too strong to ignore. "We should go," Emma said, her voice firm with determination. "If Aunt Beatrice's family has any connection to what Clara wrote about, we need to find out." By the afternoon, Louise, Emma, and Peter had piled into the family car, armed with the postcard and a map. The drive to Maplewood took them through rolling hills and past quiet farms, the scenery stirring a sense of nostalgia for Louise. When they arrived, the town was quaint and unassuming, its main street lined with brick storefronts and leafy trees. Their first stop was the town library, where a helpful librarian assisted them in searching local records. Within an hour, they found a mention of Beatrice Reynolds in an old census document. She had lived in Maplewood for several decades and had a daughter named Sarah. Armed with this new information, the family tracked down Sarah's address with the help of a local directory. The house was a modest white bungalow with a neatly kept garden. Louise felt a pang of nerves as she approached the door, but Emma's hand on her arm steadied her. When the door opened, they were greeted by a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a cautious smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Are you Sarah?" Louise asked. The woman nodded, her expression curious. "I'm Louise Reynolds," Louise said. "I believe we may be related." Sarah's eyes widened, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then she stepped back and gestured for them to come inside. "Well," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "I'll be damned."
"Come in, then.
Let's see what we can figure out." The afternoon that followed was filled with stories, questions, and revelations. Sarah confirmed the estrangement between Clara and Beatrice, recounting how a dispute over an inheritance had driven the sisters apart. Beatrice had moved to Maplewood to start anew, but the pain of the rift had lingered. "I always wondered what happened to Clara," Sarah said, her voice tinged with sadness. Beatrice talked about her sometimes, but it always seemed like a wound that never healed. As the conversation unfolded, Sarah revealed something extraordinary. Beatrice had also created a quilt, one remarkably similar to the Reynolds family quilt. However, Sarah explained it was incomplete, missing several patches. "It's in the attic," Sarah said. "Would you like to see it?" When Sarah brought out the quilt, the resemblance was undeniable. Louise's breath caught as she noticed that some of the missing patches from Beatrice's quilt matched the patterns on Clara's. It was as if the two quilts were pieces of a larger puzzle, fragments of a shared story, waiting to be reunited. For the Reynolds family, the discovery was bittersweet. The quilts told a tale of division, but they also offered a chance for reconciliation. As Louise and Sarah exchanged knowing looks, they both understood that the journey was far from over. The quilts, like the families they represented, needed mending. The living room of Sarah's bungalow became a hive of activity as the two quilts were laid side by side. The family gathered around, marveling at how the patterns and patches seemed to speak to one another. Each quilt carried its own distinct story, yet together, they hinted at a shared legacy that had been fractured by time and conflict. Louise ran her fingers over the patches of Beatrice's quilt, her touch lingering on the spaces where fabric was missing. "These gaps," she murmured, "are where pieces from our quilt fit, aren't they?" Sarah nodded, her expression contemplative. "I've always wondered about those. My mother told me they were meant to hold something important, but she never finished it. She said it was too painful." Emma, ever the detective, was already snapping pictures of the quilts on her phone. "Look," she said, pointing to one patch on Beatrice's quilt. "This symbol matches a patch on ours." It was a small embroidered flower with intricate petals, its edges slightly frayed with age. Louise leaned closer. "That flower, it's from Clara's garden. She used to grow them in the backyard. And here," Sarah added, pointing to another patch. "This is from my mother's wedding dress. She always said it was her proudest day." As they continued comparing the quilts, a pattern began to emerge. Certain patches on Clara's quilt seemed to align with the missing spaces on Beatrice's, and vice versa. But beyond the physical connections, there were deeper implications, stories woven into the fabric that hinted at moments of shared joy and sorrow, now waiting to be unearthed. "What if the quilts are trying to tell us something?" Emma mused, half joking. "Like a puzzle we need to solve." Sarah chuckled. "It does feel that way, doesn't it?" The idea was enough to galvanize the family. Over the next few days, the Reynolds and Sarah worked together to piece the story behind the quilts. They delved into family records, old letters, and photographs, their efforts uncovering a narrative that had been buried for decades. One discovery stood out: a series of letters exchanged between Clara and Beatrice in the years before their estrangement. The letters, which had been tucked away in a box in Louise's attic, revealed a tale of two sisters deeply devoted to one another but ultimately divided by a bitter dispute over their inheritance. The conflict had centered on their parents' estate, a modest farm that both women had cherished. When their father passed away, his will had left the property to Clara, the elder sister, while Beatrice received only a small sum of money. She felt betrayed, Sarah explained, her voice heavy with emotion. She loved that farm. She told me once that it was the only place that ever felt like home. Louise nodded. Clara must have known that, but she always believed she was honoring their father's wishes. She didn't realize how much it would hurt Beatrice. The letters also hinted at a desire for reconciliation. Beatrice had written several times, expressing her regret for how things had ended. But Clara, burdened by her own guilt, had never responded. The silence between them had grown into a chasm, one that neither sister had been able to bridge in their lifetimes. "Maybe this is our chance to fix that," Emma said quietly. Her words struck a chord with everyone in the room. The quilts, they realized, were more than just heirlooms. They were symbols of the sisters' bond, fractured but not irreparable. And the clues hidden within them might offer a path toward healing, not just for Clara and Beatrice's story, but for the family as a whole. Among the most intriguing discoveries was a motif that appeared on both quilts, a small, embroidered key. On Beatrice's quilt, the key was stitched in golden thread, its edges slightly worn. On Clara's, the same key was rendered in silver. Beneath each key was a cryptic symbol that none of them could decipher. "It looks like a map," Peter said, squinting at the symbols. "Or directions, maybe." Emma pulled up a map of the old Reynolds farm on her phone, overlaying the quilt's design with its geography. "What if it's pointing to a specific place?" she suggested. "Something hidden on the properties." The idea reignited the family's excitement. They agreed to visit the old farm, now abandoned, to see if the quilts truly held the key to Clara's treasure. For Sarah, it was an opportunity to reconnect with a part of her heritage she had only heard about in stories. For Louise, it was a chance to honor her grandmother's legacy and mend the broken threads of their history. As they packed the quilts carefully into protective cases, Louise felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. The journey ahead was uncertain, but it was also a chance to bring their family closer together. And as she looked at Emma, Peter, and Sarah, she realized that the quilts had already begun their work, weaving bonds between generations and bridging the gap between past and present. "Let's find out what Clara and Beatrice were trying to tell us," she said, her voice steady with resolve. "Let's piece this story together." The Reynolds family and Sarah stood at the edge of the old farm, their breaths caught in a collective moment of awe and trepidation. The land was a shadow of its former self. Once vibrant fields now lay fallow, tangled with weeds and wildflowers, while the farmhouse itself leaned wearily to one side, its white paint peeling like bark from an ancient tree. "It's been years since anyone set foot here," Louise murmured, her voice tinged with nostalgia. The sight of the place stirred bittersweet memories, as if the farm itself remembered all that had transpired within its boundaries. Emma and Peter carried the carefully packed quilts, while Sarah clutched a notebook filled with clues and notes they'd compiled. The embroidered keys on the quilts had led them here, each symbol hinting at something buried within the farm's grounds. Now, they were determined to uncover Clara's hidden treasure and finally mend the broken ties between their families. "Where do we start?" Emma asked, her eyes scanning the property. Peter unfolded a printed copy of the farm's layout, overlaid with the cryptic designs from the quilts. "If this pattern matches the land," he said, pointing to a cluster of symbols near the bottom corner of Beatrice's quilt, "then we're looking for a spot near the old barn." The barn was a skeletal structure at the edge of the property, its roof partially caved in but its frame still standing resolutely against the encroaching wilderness. As they approached, the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. Louise held her breath, feeling as though Clara and Beatrice's spirits lingered, watching over them. "Here," Emma said, kneeling near a patch of overgrown grass just outside the barn's entrance. She consulted the quilts, tracing the lines of the golden and silver keys with her finger. "This is where the two symbols intersect." Peter handed her a small spade, and Emma began to dig, her hands moving with a mixture of eagerness and reverence. The others watched in silence, the tension palpable. After several minutes, the spade struck something solid. Emma's eyes widened as she cleared away the dirt, revealing the corner of an old wooden chest. Together, they unearthed the chest, its once sturdy wood now fragile with age. Louise knelt beside it, her hands trembling as she reached for the rusted latch. It creaked in protest but finally gave way, revealing the contents within. Inside were bundles of letters, photographs, and documents, all meticulously preserved despite the passage of time. Louise gently lifted the topmost item, a sepia-toned photograph of Clara and Beatrice as young women, their arms linked and their smiles radiant. "They look so happy," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. Beneath the photograph was a stack of letters written in Clara's familiar hand. Louise unfolded one and began to read aloud. The letter was addressed to Beatrice, filled with heartfelt apologies and a longing for reconciliation. It became clear that Clara had written these letters after their estrangement, but had never sent them. Instead, she had hidden them away, perhaps hoping that one day they would find their way to Beatrice's descendants. She wanted to make amends, Louise said, tears welling in her eyes. She just didn't know how. As they sifted through the chest, they found more treasures: a locket containing a tiny pressed flower, a journal detailing the sisters' childhood adventures, and a folded map marked with significant locations on the farm. Each item painted a vivid picture of the bond Clara and Beatrice had shared before it was fractured by misunderstanding and pride. "These aren't treasures in the traditional sense," Peter remarked, holding up the journal. "But they're priceless in their own way." The map included one final marker, a spot near the farmhouse. "What do you think is there?" Emma asked. "Let's find out," Louise said, her voice steady with resolve. The group made their way to the marked location, a small patch of land near the farmhouse's back porch. The ground here was less overgrown, as if it had been tended to long after the rest of the farm had been abandoned. Louise knelt again, her hands brushing the earth. "Help me dig," she said. Together, they worked quickly but carefully, revealing a flat, weathered stone etched with a simple inscription, "For Beatrice. Love always, Clara." Louise's breath hitched as she read the words. Beneath the stone, they found a small metal box containing another letter from Clara. This one was addressed directly to whoever might find it. In it, she explained her regrets, her hopes for the family's future, and her wish that the quilts would one day bring her descendants together to heal what had been broken. She never gave up on her sister, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Even after everything, Louise placed the letter gently back into the box. "She wanted us to find this," she said, "to bring our families back together." As the sun began to set over the farm, the group stood in a circle, the two quilts draped over their shoulders like shared cloaks. In that moment, the weight of the past felt lighter, as if the fractures in their family's history had begun to heal. The quilts, once symbols of division, had now become emblems of unity and hope. "We'll mend them together," Louise said, her voice firm with determination. "Both the quilts and our family." The others nodded, their faces glowing with resolve. The journey had not only uncovered Clara's treasure, but had also brought them closer than ever. As they left the farm, carrying the quilts and chest with them, they knew that the real treasure was not in the items they had found but in the bonds they had rebuilt along the way. The Reynolds family and Sarah returned from the farm with the quilts, the chest, and a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had stirred something profound within each of them, a desire not only to preserve their family's legacy, but also to strengthen the bonds that had been frayed over time. They agreed to meet again the following weekend at Louise's home to decide how best to honor Clara and Beatrice's wishes. That Saturday, the family gathered in the living room, the quilts spread side by side on the large dining table. The chest sat nearby, its contents carefully organized into neat piles of letters, photographs, and keepsakes. Louise stood at the head of the table, her hands resting on the fabric as she looked at the faces of her children, grandchildren, and Sarah. "Clara and Beatrice were trying to tell us something," Louise began, her voice steady and full of warmth. "They wanted us to see that even though there were divisions and disagreements, the love they shared as sisters never truly disappeared. That love is what we're carrying forward today." Emma, who had been instrumental in uncovering the story, stepped forward. "I think the quilts should be mended together," she said, her eyes bright with conviction. They're already pieces of the same story. Bringing them together would symbolize the reconciliation Clara and Beatrice never got to have. Sarah nodded, a smile spreading across her face. I think Beatrice would have liked that. She always said quilts were about bringing scraps together to create something beautiful. The family agreed unanimously. Over the next several weeks, they worked together to carefully mend and join the two quilts. Louise oversaw the stitching, her hands steady despite the years of where they had seen. Emma and Sarah worked side by side, sharing stories and laughter as they sewed. Even Peter, who had never touched a needle and thread in his life, contributed by helping to prepare the fabric and untangle threads. As the quilts came together, so did the family. Old grievances were aired and resolved, misunderstandings were clarified, and a new sense of unity began to take root. The process of mending the quilts became a metaphor for mending their relationships. By the time the final stitches were sewn, the quilts had become a single masterpiece, a tapestry of resilience, love, and forgiveness. The unveiling of the newly united quilt took place at the next family reunion. Louise hosted it in her backyard, where tables were set with fresh flowers and the air hummed with the chatter of relatives catching up. At the center of it all was the quilt, draped over a wooden stand, its vibrant patterns catching the sunlight. When the time came for the unveiling, Louise stepped forward, her voice carrying over the gathered crowd. This quilt is more than just fabric and thread, she said. It's the story of our family, our joys, our struggles, and our journey toward healing. Clara and Beatrice may not have been able to reconcile in their lifetime, but through this quilt, their love and their hope for unity live on. As she pulled back the covering, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The quilt was stunning, its patches seamlessly blending the styles and histories of both Clara and Beatrice's work. The golden and silver keys, once separate, now formed an intricate centerpiece, their symbols aligned to create a motif of interlocking hearts. Beneath them, Louise had stitched Clara's final words, "Mend what was broken." Tears glistened in Sarah's eyes as she stepped forward to touch the quilt. "It's beautiful," she whispered. They would be so proud. The reunion became a celebration of renewal. Family members shared stories inspired by the quilt, reminiscing about loved ones who had passed and creating new memories with those who were present. The children played games on the lawn, their laughter echoing across the yard, while the adults lingered by the quilt, tracing its stitches and marveling at the craftsmanship. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the family gathered for a group photo, the quilt held proudly in the center. Louise looked around at the faces of her loved ones, her heart full. For the first time in years, she felt the strength of the family's bond, as unbreakable as the stitches that now held the quilt together. In the months that followed, the quilt became the centerpiece of a new family tradition. Each year at the reunion, it was displayed as a reminder of their shared history and their commitment to unity. Emma documented the entire journey, compiling the letters, photographs, and stories into a book that she titled Mending the Past, the story of the Reynolds family quilt. Copies were distributed to every branch of the family, ensuring that the legacy of Clara and Beatrice would be preserved for generations to come. Louise kept the original quilt in her home, hanging it in a place of honor where she could see it every day. It served as a constant reminder of the power of forgiveness and the beauty of coming together. And though the journey had started with a torn piece of fabric, it had ended with something far greater, a family made whole once more. Thank you for sticking around until the end. Again, if you enjoyed the story, remember to like and subscribe and share this video with your loved ones.